The period from 1815 to 1914 is referred to as Pax Britannica, when the British Empire's global dominance on the military, technology, and global trade front led to a period of relative peace across the globe. Between 1920 and 1922, the British Empire reached its peak, covering roughly 24% of Earth's land surface and governing 458 million people. But within 25 years, immediately following World War II, the British Empire collapsed, driven by severe financial exhaustion. Hi, you're listening to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we look at why empires collapse, the reasons and the circumstances that lead to the collapse. At the outset, one can say that the primary reason for the collapse of empires is arrogance. The empire, which has been a global dominator for more than a century, suddenly begins to believe that they were always destined to be great, and the laws of physics, economics, global trade no longer apply. And the first place this is often visible is the empire stretching its resources too thin. The factors that drove the phenomenal rise of the British Empire were a strong navy and the Industrial Revolution. As the Industrial Revolution kicked off in the 1760s, Great Britain needed a market for its industrially manufactured goods. Now, Great Britain itself is an island nation, and its population was not big enough to consume the goods being manufactured at an industrial scale. But being an island nation also had its benefits, because it did not need to maintain a very strong standing army. So it invested heavily in its navy, which was able to capture and colonize lands along its sea routes. And this colonization stretched across the globe, from the Americas to Africa to Asia. And because of this alone, Great Britain needed a lot of resources, both human and machines, to manage and maintain these colonies. Around the same time as Britain, Japan emerged as a dominant empire on the Eastern Hemisphere. Japan's dominance, too, was built upon a very strong navy and industrialization. But unlike Great Britain, the trigger point wasn't an industrial revolution, but the humiliating Treaty of Kanagawa, which was signed in 1854 by the Japanese and the US Navy Commodore Matthew Perry. This treaty made the Japanese realize that they had been living in seclusion while the Western world had made major advances in the fields of warfare, science and technology, and economics. And this led to a sustained period of modernization in Japan during the term of the new Emperor Meiji between 1868 and 1912, which is often termed the Meiji Restoration period. Several Japanese missions were sent to the West during this period to study institutions such as banking, schools, political systems, treaty structures, and other educational institutions. The Japanese also brought hundreds of Westerners called yatoi to Japan to teach English, build railroads and buildings, create an educational system, edit newspapers, and teach science. Now, one of the key things that the Japanese wanted to learn from the West was how to negotiate and formalize favorable treaties. They had always felt that the 1854 Treaty of Kanagawa was too favorable to the West, and they wanted to learn what the Japanese could have done better. And all these modernization efforts showed results when in 1905, the Japanese inflicted a crushing defeat on the Russians, primarily on the back of a very strong navy. This concluded the Russo-Japanese War, and the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed between the Japanese and the Russians in 1905, and this had terms very favorable to Japanese imperial interests in Northeast Asia. Japan continued its regional expansion at this point, and by the beginning of the First World War, Japan had emerged as a major world power in the Eastern Hemisphere. Now, World War I is where the British Empire ended up going overboard with respect to stretching its human resources and financial resources. I say financial because Great Britain borrowed heavily to fund its participation in World War I. Wait, but why did it borrow heavily? It had massive resources with respect to its empire. It had been a pioneer with respect to the Industrial Revolution, so its industries were also churning. So why did it need to borrow? Well, one key development was the Second Industrial Revolution. The industries and the economies of Germany and the United States were built on the base of the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution from 1870 to 1914, which was focused on steel, electricity, chemicals, and internal combustion engines. The British industrial economy was still based off of the First Industrial Revolution, which happened between 1760 and 1840, and was based on steam engine, coal, iron, and water power. So from an industrial competitiveness, the British industry was lagging behind. In fact, the first signs of the decline of the British Empire were visible in the Boer War in South Africa between 1899 and 1902. The war was fought between the British Empire and two independent Boer republics in South Africa over territorial control, political rights, and gold. The war lasted approximately 3 years, and the British Empire ultimately won, but their inability to defeat a small force of farmers made it painfully clear that the days of the British imperial expansion were coming to a close. And one of the key differentiators between the two sides was the rifles used in this war. The Boers used the German-made 7mm Mauser rifle, whereas the British forces were using the obsolete Lee-Metford Enfield rifles. The Mauser used a superior 5-round clip loading system and smokeless powder, which allowed for faster loading and better accuracy compared to the single cartridge loading of the British rifles. So by the end of World War I, the British had incurred a debt of 7.7 billion pounds, which was approximately 125% of their GDP. 125% of the GDP, meaning your entire GDP alone would not be able to pay off the debt. And by some strange coincidence, as of early 2026, the US national debt is approximately 125% of its GDP. The British realized that they had stretched their resources. So under the 1926 Balfour Declaration and 1931 Statute of Westminster, they granted autonomy to their primarily white colonies, which included Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Essentially, the British Commonwealth was born here, and the main reason for the creation of the Commonwealth was to create a British-centric economic zone where the ex-colonies by default would become Great Britain's trading partners. While it stretched its resources during World War I, Great Britain also defied the laws of economics during the war. At that time, the world economies followed the gold standard. So the amount of money in circulation within an economy was equal to the gold reserves it had. But Great Britain needed a lot more money to finance the war than the gold reserves it had. So what did it do? Got rid of the gold standard. So it could print a lot more money than the gold reserves it had. And the impact of this decision? The British pound lost its standing as the global reserve currency. And it is here that the US dollar started making a presence and New York gradually started emerging as the financial capital of the world. The interesting part here is that the arrogance of being a global empire was intact, and the Britons were confident that soon after World War I, they would be able to get back to the gold standard and re-establish the British pound as the global reserve currency. And since the Allies came out victorious at the end of World War I, the Britons were now confident that all these goals could be achieved. But in reality, there were only two winners at the end of World War I: the United States and Japan. During the course of the war, the US exports of metals, machinery, food, and other goods grew from $2.4 billion in 1913 to $6.2 billion in 1917. And as a result, the US shifted from a net debtor to a major creditor nation. It was no surprise that New York emerged as the global center of finance. Japan, too, transitioned from a debtor to a creditor nation for the first time in its history. Its industries like shipbuilding, chemicals, and textiles led to Japan's exports quadrupling between 1913 and 1918. And the source of these exports were primarily the goods and services provided to the Allied forces during World War I, which included arms and merchant ships. So essentially, both the United States and Japan provided the supplies to the Allied forces during World War I and converted from a net debtor to creditor nations. Now, unlike the United States, which focused domestically post-World War I, Japan embarked upon territorial expansion immediately after World War I. Why? Because just like Great Britain, Japan felt that as an island nation with few natural resources, it needed to have better control on raw materials like oil, iron, coal, and rubber to fuel its rapidly industrializing economy. But there was a deeper reason for Japan's aggressive stance post-World War I. During the course of World War I, Japan had occupied key areas in China and was trying to convert it into a protectorate. And this created a lot of tensions with the Western powers. The second was the rejection of its racial equality clause, which was proposed during the 1919 Paris Conference. The clause demanded equal treatment for all alien nationals of the League of Nations member states, regardless of race. Basically, Japan was trying to protect its nationals from discriminatory laws in countries like the United States and gain recognition as an equal to Western powers. And this snub by the Western powers gave Japan the impression that it was not being treated equally and with respect, despite having helped the Allies win World War I. So Japan ended up overextending its military. And just like World War I created a financial and economic strain on the Britons, Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 stretched its financial and military resources. Japan had to pour vast amounts of capital into Manchuria to build heavy industry, railways, and factories intended for resource extraction. And to protect these economic interests, Japan was forced to maintain a permanent, large-scale military presence in Manchuria. And to give an idea of the impact, Japan's military spending was approximately 400 million yen in 1930, but by 1936, this figure had nearly tripled to 1.1 billion yen. And just like the Britons, the military spending needed financial backing, and the government resorted to deficit financing, that is, issuing of national bonds, to bridge the funding gap without raising taxes. Finance Minister Korekiyo Takahashi was trying to pull the Japanese economy out of the Great Depression, but he was assassinated by military radicals in 1936 when he attempted to rein in the ballooning military budget. And this was followed by the entire money market coming under direct control of the state to ensure that funds were funneled to the military rather than the non-military sectors. Japan now was operating more like a military state rather than a global industrial economy. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the British were trying to get back their glory and reassert London as the financial center of the world. And the folks at the Bank of England and Treasury felt that the only way to do that would be to return to the gold standard. But they set one more target, and that was to get the British pound back to the pre-World War I rate of $4.86. And how were they going to achieve all this? Basically, reverse all that they had done during World War I. So they started with artificially creating deflationary conditions. That is, make the availability of the British pound scarce. And this was to be achieved by raising interest rates and cutting governmental spending. So at a critical time when the British industry needed to invest in new technology, the British government strangulated the availability of money for such an investment. And there was only one economist who warned the folks at the Bank of England, the Treasury, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, that this strategy was going to prove to be disastrous. The economist, John Maynard Keynes. And his warnings came true because the British pound was artificially inflated, which made it more expensive than the other currencies, making British goods more expensive to buy, which forced employers to cut wages, which forced workers to go on strikes across England. And the loss in productivity is the third factor after the overextension of the resources and military and defiance of laws of finance and economics that contributes to the collapse of empires. And with the decline in productivity, Great Britain was spending heavily on imports. And because of this, by 1939, millions in gold and foreign reserves were depleted. And by 1940, during the initial days of World War II, Great Britain was virtually bankrupt. It did not have the money to fund the war. So how was it able to continue in the war? The answer? The Lend-Lease Act, signed into law in March of 1941 by US President FDR. While at this stage the US was still neutral, the act allowed the United States to provide military aid, food, and oil to allied nations, notably Great Britain, during World War II. By the end of the war in 1945, the United States had distributed approximately $50 billion in total aid, which roughly equals $690 billion in 2020 dollars. And out of the $50 billion, Great Britain received $31 billion worth of aid. So was Great Britain able to repay this loan? Not really. Most of the aid provided between 1941 and 1945 was written off by the US in exchange for British cooperation in establishing a new international economic order which had the US dollar as the reserve currency. Not just that, Great Britain was also expected to allow the US to use its military bases, transfer technology like jet engines and radar to the US, and provide supplies to the US troops stationed in the United Kingdom. And this is the fourth stage of the collapse of empires, when the empire becomes a vassal or a satellite state to a new powerful empire. And just a small tidbit of information, Great Britain received an Anglo-American loan in 1946, which was a $3.75 billion line of credit to stabilize the British economy. And the UK made its final payment on that loan of $83.3 million on December 29, 2006. Meanwhile, by the start of World War II, Japan had fully transitioned into a military dictatorship, with all political parties getting dissolved in 1940, and General Hideki Tojo becoming Prime Minister in October of 1941. And very similar to Great Britain, Japan by 1944 had accumulated a national debt that exceeded its national income by 260%. To finance the war without international credit, the government had forced citizens and banks to purchase massive amounts of war bonds. And after its defeat, the Japanese government effectively defaulted on its debt. Japan imposed a 100% war indemnity special tax on whatever they owed to the citizens, rendering the war bonds worthless. And since the currency had become worthless, the government eventually forced its citizens to exchange old yen for the new yen, effectively confiscating private savings. But besides the overextension of its resources and defiance of financial laws, another factor that accelerated the decline of the Empire of Japan was that it tried to take on the world solo. Towards the end of World War II, between March and August of 1945, the Allies launched Operation Starvation, which aimed at disrupting Japan's economic supply chain. 90% of Japan's oil and 20% of its food came from Japan's conquered territories and colonies. And under Operation Starvation, B-29s flew over 1,500 sorties, dropping more than 12,000 acoustic and magnetic mines into vital Japanese waterways, which moved goods from the colonies to mainland Japan. By the end of the campaign, 670 ships had been sunk or destroyed, and the traffic through the ports had declined by 85%. At this point, Japan's survival in World War II was completely unsustainable. And since it was defeated in World War II, Japan essentially became a protectorate of the United States for about 7 years post-World War II. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which is the most popular Shakespearean phrase? To be or not to be? That is the question. From Hamlet, ranks as the number one Shakespearean phrase. And the options provided were ordered in the descending order of popularity. So the answer is A, to be or not to be. That is the question from Hamlet. Question from the current episode. Which American food gained iconic status during World War II? Was it A, peanut butter and jelly sandwich, B, Spam, C, Kraft mac and cheese, or D, canned beans? Once again, which American food gained iconic status during World War II? Was it A, peanut butter and jelly sandwich, B, Spam, C, Kraft mac and cheese, or D, canned beans? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. We meet again in 2 weeks with another interesting and exciting episode on world history. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.